Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to our panel titled Interfaith and Antisemitism, Responses That Bind Us. We're being recorded, so this is being recorded and also on the YouTube channel of the University of Haifa. And it will, so it's both live and recorded. And we put together this panel essentially in the understanding that interfaith plays a role in understanding anti-Semitism, in combating anti-Semitism, in the world post-October 7, in the world that we are living in. So we essentially want to kind of explore a few things along those avenues. We want to try and understand what interfaith work is for each of you, women. I think there's maybe a gender question I need to add, but I'm sure you'll bring it into the conversation. I'll just say a few words about myself. So we're going to talk about interfaith and anti-Semitism. We're going to talk about interfaith work in general. We're going to talk about what happened after October 7. We're going to talk about anti-Semitism and the way in which maybe interfaith offers solutions, but maybe also challenges in the world of interfaith, both based on all of your experiences. And then I want to delve into the issue of your recent book, Georgette, Half Jew, Full Life, which relates to a variety of identity questions that I think will also play into the discussion with our other discussants. And we want to conclude with an attempt to understand what is the silver lining in the time we're living in, where can we potentially take this, where would we like to go, okay? So can someone just close the door because of the sound? Okay, great. I'll introduce myself. So I'm David Barak-Gorodetsky. I run the center. I run the Comper Center for Anti-Semitism Studies at the University of Haifa. I'm also a rabbi, so this relates to my work in a variety of ways. And I've been thinking about this topic in various kind of aspects. I'll introduce our speakers, okay? And I'll start with Georgette, and then I'll move to Jules, and then to Iman. So Iman, unfortunately, I don't have your bio with me at the moment, so we'll discuss your bio as we move to that moment. Dr. Georgette Bennett is an award-winning sociologist who has practiced mostly in non-academic settings. She's a widely published author, popular lecturer, and former broadcast journalist. An innovative and entrepreneurial leader, she's an active philanthropist focusing on conflict resolution, human rights, humanitarian diplomacy, and interreligious relations. In her earlier career as a criminologist, she did pioneering work in what is now known as community policing, consulted on criminal justice, staffing studies for the US Department of Justice, served as personal consultant to the New York City Police Commissioner, and managed the budget for all New York City criminal justice operations as its Office of Management and Budget. In 1992, Bennett founded the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, the go-to organization for combating religious prejudice. She's a co-founder of the Global Covenant of Religion, Global Covenant Partners, which focuses on delegitimizing the use of religion to justify violence and extremism. I think this is something we can relate to. To that end, Bennett served in the US State Department's Religion and Foreign Policy Initiative, working group on conflict mitigation, tasked with developing recommendations for the US Secretary of State on countering religious-based violence. In 2013, Bennett founded the Multifaith Alliance, which has since worked to raise awareness and mobilize humanitarian aid, benefiting almost 4 million Syrian war victims. Dr. Bennett was the winner of the 2020 AARP Purpose Prize for her work with MFA. Bennett is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and past chair of the Jewish Funders Network. In 2021, she was selected as one of the Forbes 50 over 50 Women of Impact. Jules Freeman studied theology and biblical studies at the University of Durham with research interests in reception, history of the Hebrew Bible, and Jewish-Christian relations. Her doctoral research focused on the intersection between Western religion, education, and politics in relation to Israel's contemporary context, integrating religio-political analysis with critical contemporary anti-Semitism studies. In summer 2025, she was a scholar in residence with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism, ISGAP, and Policy at the University of Oxford. Jules combined teaching and academic research with strategic advisory work that shapes public discourse and institutional responses. A specialist in Christian anti-Semitism, she guides religious and political organizations to combat contemporary anti-Semitism, engage in interfaith dialogue, and impact policy development. And Iman, is it okay that I'll let you introduce yourself?
No worries. I think maybe we have to take it around. So my name is Iman Atta. I'm a human rights activist. I run two organizations in the UK. They're called Faith Matters and Mama. They work around countering extremism, interfaith dialogue, community cohesion, and tackling racism. As well as another organization that works around supporting refugee communities, specifically those that come from the Middle East, and empowering them with education, with microfinance projects. And my background comes from research, but I've been working in advocacy now for over a decade.
So we have here, let's say, an intersection of both policy and education and research and organizational building in relation to interfaith. And I want to start by asking you, what brought you to this field of interfaith? What is it that brought you to engage in this? What was your cause?
Well, what brought me to it was the death of my late husband, Rabbi Mark Tanenbaum, who was a pioneer in the field of interreligious relations and a well-known human rights activist. And when he died, he left me feeling very inspired, not by his death, but by his life. When he died in 1992, there were at least 50 conflicts being waged around the world that were based, at least in part, on religion. And those conflicts had generated about 40 million refugees, and of course, hundreds of millions of dollars in destruction, and hundreds of thousands of lives lost. Of course, today the numbers are much larger. So I decided that nothing that I had been doing professionally was as important as building on his work. And so I founded the Tanenbaum Center to do that. But unlike most interreligious organizations, we are not focused on interreligious dialogue, because as important and as personally transformative as dialogue is, it has very little impact beyond the four walls in which it's taking place. So our focus is on meeting people where they are and on implementing change through the institutions that mold behavior and the institutions that impact people. So we focus on education, we focus on the role of religion in conflict resolution, we focus on healthcare, and we also focus, and this is maybe the most important focus, the workplace, because that's where people make their living, so you can really impact them there.
Hi. I think I initially came with an interest in interfaith really academically. It was through studying biblical studies, through studying theology, and looking at how Judaism and Christianity interacted with each other within that, how they were identified within that, how they were represented within that, that really interested me. And then into thinking about, as contemporary theologians, as contemporary Bible scholars, how do we engage with each other within our own spaces, religious spaces? And then that translated into an interest in the religious context, so working with churches and with synagogues and interfaith groups, organizations like the Council of Christians and Jews, that sort of thing. And then it developed outwards from there, really, in terms of other organizations, religious, political organizations, and how they were impacted. So it worked outwards from an academic center, if you like.
Dialogue works to that end?
Oh, that's very interesting. So a lot of interfaith dialogue in the UK has largely relied on dialogue and also on sort of social justice initiatives, working together on common endeavours for ethical purposes, tikkun olam. And one of the things that really came out following October 7th was the limits of that approach. It's an approach that had been encouraged for a long time, I think, because there was a desire, you know, post Nostra Aetate, to encourage bridge building, relationship building, and that's fantastic, and there's such a place for it. But after October 7th, a lot of relationships in different contexts were tested. And suddenly it seemed that there was a lack of language to tackle some of the difficulties that had been perhaps set aside in order to facilitate and prioritize relational priorities. And so I think dialogue has a huge place. I think interfaith activities, sharing cups of tea, all these things are terribly important, especially at, at grassroots level as well. But I don't think that they're enough on their own, and I think that's one of the lessons that we've learnt in the last few years.
My interest in interfaith is actually where I come from. So I'm born in this country, and this country speaks on itself about like the diversity in religions, but also connecting dialogue and conflict resolution. So when I moved to the UK, I volunteered for an organization that works on interfaith dialogue, but also equally around community cohesion and integration, and then adapted some of the concepts I learned here around conflict resolution to bring communities together. But that was not just about communities of religion, but also communities that do not have any religion, which is more challenging now than it was ever. And as Jules said, post-October 7th, those bridges were broken. And its dialogue is no longer enough. And I think there's more that needs to be done to bring that notion where communities of different faiths, backgrounds can come together. I still believe that communities can come together. An example of this is really some of the work that we do with organizations in the UK that are Jewish organizations, and where it was a challenging time to continue that engagement with them post-October 7th. But based on the values of what we believe in, this was an mission that we'll continue to do.
Georgette, what was your post-October 7th experience with LFA, Tanenbaum Center?
Well, the post-October 7th experience was really devastating. Certainly what's going on college campuses in the US and elsewhere, which is so much the product of binary thinking. And that's exactly where the difficulty of binary thinking was so dramatized, because you either had to be pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. And that's a false dichotomy. It implies that they're mutually exclusive. They are not mutually exclusive. You can be pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. It's called being pro-humanity. And I blame faculties at a lot of universities because what they are preaching is binary thinking. You are either the oppressor or the oppressed. You are either the colonizer or the colonized. And that's not where reality exists in those extremes. Reality exists in the murky middle. And that's what students especially need to get comfortable with. The murky middle, where things are not so clear. Because when you are thinking in terms of false dichotomies, when you're doing binary thinking, it's apocalyptic thinking. You're dividing the world into the children of light and the children of darkness. And if you're in the pro-Palestine box, you're subjected to purity tests there. And if you're in the pro-Israel box, you're subjected to purity tests there. And those purity tests mean that there is no way to actually communicate with each other because you're too busy demonizing each other. And if you can't communicate, you can't find solutions. So that's my post-October 7th experience.
Thanks also for the honesty, and you know, we've all experienced you know, the just how difficult things have been. Jules, in terms of the interfaith work that you've been involved in post-October 7, what's it been like?
It's been challenging.
I haven't heard you saying something similar.
You know, I think that one of the challenges, I think, within Jewish-Christian relations, which is the area that I work in, is that there's a very strong impulse for universalization within Christianity, and that tends to move us towards a methodology, if you like, in Jewish-Christian relations, where there's a strong tendency to look for what we have in common. And whilst that's unifying, and there's a lot to be learned and shared in that, there's also a place for being able to discuss in a healthy way the areas in which we differ and that set us apart. And I think that's been one of the biggest challenges, because October 7th thrust us almost into a crisis environment. And trying to discuss difference and things that set us apart in that kind of environment is incredibly difficult. And it was a very emotive atmosphere, temperatures are very high, and there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of polarization, as you were saying, Georgette. People are very entrenched, and because of that, because it doesn't feel like a very safe space to ask questions, to learn more necessarily, what it happens to do is it pushes people back into their own polarized spaces. And I think one of the things that I find interesting is that I think often more polemical approaches in interfaith, quite often it's because people are trying to protect something from a perceived threat. There is something that they deeply value that they feel is under threat. And so in some ways it's helpful perhaps to think of it as a defense move rather than an offensive move. And so part of the effort is trying to bring that temperature down, trying to see each other as both in a situation where we're valuing things and trying to defend things that are valuable, rather than thinking in polemical terms, and just bringing the conversation back into a hospitable environment.
So Iman, I'm reminded also of our earlier conversation about this. Do we really need religion in the work of between Jewish and Muslim communities? Is religion itself really helpful at the moment? Tarek Masoud from Harvard has also claimed, I think, things similar to what I've heard from you. Can we even use religion, or so we put it aside?
It's a very interesting question. Maybe if I talk from the perspective of the UK and what we've seen, and connecting it as well to the previous speakers on October 7th. So that division between Muslim communities and Jewish communities became so strong post-October 7th. One, on two notions. One, we know anti-Semitism has just spiraled post-October 7th, but equally anti-Muslim hatred has risen post-October 7th. And one of the things that we've seen is that, reflecting back on Georgette's point, is both communities decided to say, well, no, we're being attacked more than you're being attacked. No, we're being attacked more than being attacked. And using religion as a way to pit one community versus the other. That's one. Two, I think one of the things as well that we've seen is that this is not, we're not talking about things that are happening in the online space or in a work-based setting or just university setting. We're seeing it everywhere. And we saw friendships that have broken, relationships that have broken on the back of religion, although it was not due to religion what happened post-October 7th, or on October 7th, really. So while you don't want to talk about religion, unfortunately, religion comes in the way when you're talking about Muslim and Jewish communities. And I think The one thing that has been missing, while yes, polarization became immense, I think the one thing that we always see missing in conversations between Jewish and Muslim communities is one community does not want to see the pain of the other. They just don't want to. They don't want to see the pain of the other. They're like, we are the one. We're actually paining. We're actually kind of looking inwards. Realistically, we don't see you, and likewise from the other side, we don't see you either. And that was one of the major actually fractures between these two communities specifically. That while we can agree to disagree, we can facilitate discussions, have safe conversations, create safe environments. That kind of seeing the other as human, reflecting on empathy, humanity, kindness, compassion, just disappeared. It's as if that's not part of the equation of who we are. So whether you're reflecting on religion or not, reflecting on the human aspect of things, that is gone. And that continues to be the case still today because the spiraling post-October 7th continues, unfortunately. Anti-Semitism is still growing. Anti-Muslim hatred is growing. And that discussion around, oh my God, I don't want to speak about what is happening to you. I don't want to call it out because I need to look after my own community is not a good place to be in. Because allyship, talking about other communities, challenging it in all settings is important, whether you come from a religious background or do not come from a religious background.
Yeah, sure.
I'd like to build on what you just said because I think that's very true. Was involved in 2 Muslim Jewish initiatives. One of them collapsed after October 7th. The other continued, and it's still functioning. But what you say about not recognizing the other's pain, as you know, because you're involved in conflict resolution, the first step in conflict transformation is acknowledging the pain of the other. And I'm reminded of the late, great theologian Krister Stendahl, who was dean of the Harvard Divinity School and before that Bishop of Stockholm, Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm. I always think about him because he famously said, "How can you love me if you don't know what hurts me?" And what I have found in my work is that nobody ever asks anybody, what hurts you? When I ask that question, people are stunned because nobody has ever asked them that before. And I can tell you nobody's asked me that either.
So I want to take this to Jules for a second because I think you both presented a universalist, you might say, approach to dialogue, which is understanding, our shared humanity, you might say. And I think I heard from you, Jules, and you might both want to refer to this, that for Jewish identity, sometimes it feels that, we'll get into identity in a minute also in relation to a big, for Jewish identity, it sometimes feels that if we go to the universalist path, something is lost on the way for us. Like we are expected to join into a universal kind of framework that Christianity maybe holds in and of itself. And do you think you were alluding to that? So this is to say, is the interfaith work or is bringing peace in the world a work of universalist humanity, or is it expressing our own different identity as a group and being able to negotiate those identities? That's maybe my concluding question for this section.
Yeah, it's challenging, isn't it? Because within Jewish-Christian relations, there's an asymmetry in the sense that Christian identity depends on an understanding of Judaism and making sense of it within Christianity and Christian theology in a way that Judaism doesn't have. It can stand independently without Christianity. And so the motivations behind trying to make sense of Judaism carry slightly different weights and have different implications. I think certainly from a Jewish perspective, the ability to stand apart in its distinction is vital, because it allows Judaism to be able to define itself on Jewish terms. And the risk in being universalized, of course, is because then it gets redefined and reframed in Christian terms within an architecture, if you like, that isn't authentic to Judaism. So there's always that tension there within interfaith conversations.
I think I want to let Georgette respond to this from the maybe Nostra Aetate, Rabbi Tanenbaum context, and then I want to ask you.
Yeah. Well, before responding from that context, I have a problem with the question, because every religion has universalist and particularist aspects. So I don't understand the question about, by interacting with Christians, does a Jew have to universalize Judaism? I mean, Judaism has universal aspects which are part of Christianity, are part of Islam. So I don't get the question. In terms of Nostra Aetate, that was a document that took years to come out of the Second Vatican Council. And it took years because of all of the bargaining that had to take place. I think one of the things that many Jews don't appreciate about Nostra Aetate is the risk that the Catholic Church was taking in producing that document. And that's because the Catholic bishops in Arab countries kept warning the Pope, kept warning the conclave, that the lives of Christians were under threat in Arab countries if this document was going to be too nice to the Jews. So what came out was a watered-down document, but still a historic document that reversed 2,000 years of teaching of contempt against Jews, that debunked the Christ killer charge. And so it really attacked the foundations, at least the traditional foundations of anti-Semitism. The contemporary foundations of anti-Semitism are quite different.
Thank you. Yeah, you shared also with me this information about, I was not aware of actually the history of the founding of the document that your late husband was involved with at the time. Iman, I teach it at the Interfaith program, Religious Leaders program at the University of Haifa. So this is a program of qadis and priests and imams. And my question relates from what I've learned or worked with this group. Is rebuilding of Jewish-Muslim relations, also based on what you've seen in the UK, based on, again, you might say the universal aspect, or maybe there's like a shared, we do not want to assimilate aspect on both sides. I'm quoting here an article by that I can allude to in a minute, actually saying that we are both communities that agree that we have different boundaries that keep us within our community, and then we build our relations from within our boundaries, or do we emphasize the universal aspect? And also, as a woman, where does this fit into your model of community?
Maybe I'd second the point around around the universal aspect of things. I think there's a few things. So while you can have your own identity as being a Muslim person, a Christian person, a Jewish person, a Buddhist person, okay, that doesn't mean that you cannot believe in the human rights of others and humanity and compassion and kindness and this. And while I believe that, I think even if we reflect, not just I believe in, even if we reflect on the different feasts that we have within different religions. So we practice them based on the religious practices of each religion, but that doesn't mean that we cannot celebrate them together. We cannot even go and share some of these elements together. I think when we talk about living within your own communities, that's something that I think is given from different aspects, but we live in a society as well. It's not just a community that we live in. And the society involves not just Muslim communities, Jewish communities, and other communities. And the society has got shared values, have got shared commonalities that I think all of us need to sign up to. So that's one element. And even when you talk about the interfaith dialogue or bringing different faith communities together, there's there's elements that bring us together into this, that is the shared values, the universality, the human rights, and the humanity that connects us. Now, as a woman who comes from a Muslim family and a Muslim background, I don't see a contradiction to the way I run my life, to the way I don't know, work, in terms of how I see life, okay? It's a challenge sometimes, and it does not just come maybe within my own community. It's a challenge that I see as well coming from other communities. And I'll give you an example. Within the work that I do in the UK, one of the main things that happened post-October 7th is myself, the organization that I run, getting attacked by some within the Muslim communities. Some did not like our stance and how we're working with Jewish communities. But I saw that as well coming from other communities, not just from Muslim communities, for example. So again, looking at the religious boundaries, it's not just your community sometimes, but other communities. I continue to engage with Jewish communities and reach out to my Jewish colleagues and friends. And that was not because I only thought of the humanity then. That's because those bridges and those relationships were built beforehand. You don't go on building those relationships between Jewish and Muslim communities and Christian communities and others when the bridges are shaken, okay? And about like almost then, post-October 7th, these bridges were burned out. You talk about doing this on an ongoing basis. It's part of your day-to-day activity, part of your engagement. It's not just because I'm on an interfaith program. It's not just because I need to go and speak now at Haifa University, so let me reach out to all the people that are there. It's something that you do always. That's part of who you are as an individual, living in a society that is multicultural, a society that is multi-religious or non-religious. That's one. Two, I think there's an element around not thinking when there's an issue or a point of conflict, whether I just need to stick to my own clan and my own community because I know I'm going to be targeted by others, or do I raise my head above the parapet and still believe in the shared values that I believe in, and I continue that mission with it? And what happened post-October 7th is that many retracted to their own clan or started talking about their own team rather than actually talking about all of us. So it became, let's talk about us, but not all of us together as everyone else. And that continues to be a challenge. I'm sure you see that as well as a challenge within interfaith work. And the third thing is always the one thing that comes to mind is that, well, that community gets more rights than I get or than my community gets. So why should I stand for that community? My community has got all the troubles and all the issues. So why should I stand for them? And again, reflecting back on what we believe in, going back to the universality and the universal elements of things, then I am betraying my own values if I am to say, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to stick only with what I believe in and what I want and not look at everyone else. It's not easy. It's challenging. It's like I've had extremely challenging conversations post-October 7th with many communities. Our organization got attacked. I got personally attacked. I got threats. My personal details were out there in the public domain. And there was even lobbying to cut our funding just because we continue to work with Jewish communities and we continue to challenge extremist narrative and we continue to challenge polarization. So there's a cost that comes with it. And sometimes people don't want to bear that cost and want to be like, no, let's pause, let me step back. I'll just reflect on my own things and that's it. And it's a choice people take. It's challenging. It's painful. This is something definitely that I felt post-October 7th, and it's not easy. But I thought of it as a wave that I have to kind of to surf above. And I'm glad as well I have a team that work with me that believe and is committed to the same cause, and we continue to do it. And why it's important, because when October 7th happened, and coming from this country, I reached out to Jewish colleagues I work with in the UK, Europe, and also here. And I think there was, on one hand, some were taken back. I'm like, oh my God, you are reaching out to us. I'm like, yes. And again, reflecting on the humanity aspect. And there were, and we put a statement out there, and there were some that were like, you cannot talk about this. I'm like, I'm sorry, we will talk about this. Now, that meant a lot to many from the Jewish communities, but also meant a lot to many within our wider society in the UK, that you are speaking out against something that no one wants to talk about, and everyone else wants to talk about something else. As Georgette said before, the pro-Palestinians want to talk about the pro-Palestine issues, the pro-Israel want to talk about the pro-Israel issues. But it also allowed us to penetrate and speak to workplaces, to campuses, to universities, to talk about really what we're seeing, but how you can work with Jewish communities and other communities. And it also not opened up that space only, it also opened up the space to actually showcase that despite the challenges, despite the war, despite October 7th, Jewish communities and Muslim communities can still continue to work with each other without having agendas behind it. And I emphasize the word agendas because there's always someone that says, no, there's something behind this. I'm like, no, that's the human aspect of it.
The eradication also of trust, I think, is a long kind of aspect of this. I want to step to a second into your book, Georgette, and then we'll circle back also to the anti-Semitism discussion out of it. So first of all, the book is titled Half Jew, Full Life. So can you maybe just explain the title for us?
The book is about a relative of mine and a relative of two people sitting in the back there who was born to an Aryan mother and a Jewish father, making him what the Nazis classified as a Mischling first degree. And if you were a Mischling first degree, you lost many of your rights, but you were not a deportation case. Your life was not under threat. But at the age of 13, he made a fateful decision the very week that the Nuremberg laws were enacted. He decided to become a bar mitzvah. So he didn't have the noblest of motives. One was that he wanted to fit in because all his friends were Jewish. And two, and maybe more important, he wanted a new bicycle. Well, the bicycle was stolen after 3 weeks. But the label Jew stuck. Even so, as long as he was living with an Aryan parent, he was not a deportation case. But when he was 18 years old, he fell desperately in love with a 16-year-old full Jew. And when her family received the orders to report to Gestapo headquarters for deportation, he convinced her to go underground into hiding with him. At that point, he lost the protection he had of living with an Aryan parent. Despite his not noble motives for wanting to become a bar mitzvah, he became a very, very serious Jew. Certainly not in the ritually observant sense. Absolutely not. But for his entire life, he did not want to be seen as a half Jew. He wanted to be seen as a full Jew and accepted as such. He was passionate about the state of Israel, studied everything about it, all his life longed to be here, but it wasn't until after his wife died and when he was in old age that he finally was able to come here. And then he would come year after year to visit his family here. And it's ironic that he would not have been accepted as a Jew in the state of Israel, nor by the Orthodox branch of Judaism. And yet that's all that he wanted. So the title, Half Jew, Full Life, comes from his status as a half Jew. And this is a book about his full life, which is an extraordinarily cinematic story, full of sex, violence, action, adventure. And I think you have copies for all the participants here.
Thank you. So I want to touch on this issue of identity, and I think which relates also to, I think to both of you and to maybe all of us in relation to this. So maybe Jules, what is your thought about this?
So I mean, it relates to me on a very personal basis. I was born to a Jewish father and a nominally Christian mother, and raised in a fairly secular home. And then when I was very young, I got married and became very integrated in Christian community, Christian context. And I was always very, very interested in the theological, the biblical. And I ended up in Christian leadership, lay leadership, and then studying theology and biblical studies. So I converted to Judaism and returned to what I felt were my Jewish roots, which was, these things are never simple and easy. But I think if I were to give you a devotional answer as to what happened, I would say, well, I think I had a Jewish soul, so that's why. If I were to give you an academic answer, I would say that, I think that identity has an incredibly rich texture. It has a lot of layers, and I noticed things over time that were very different from my peers around me. And I think one of the first things I noticed, and it took a while for me to notice it actually, because it was normal to me, but I suddenly noticed that I read the Bible very differently to the Christians around me. And in particular, I noticed that I would read myself into the narrative reading the Christian Bible. And I'd never noticed that I do that, but that it was a very different way of reading it. And that I identified myself, in continuity with the children of Israel, with Israel's story across Scripture. And so, yes, the story that you tell is really touches me deeply, and the way I've come out of it, of course, is with a very deep love of the church, of Christian community, of Christian theology, and also a very deep love of my Jewish faith, my Jewish context, and with a multiple grammar that speaks into both of those religions. And so for me, it's an opportunity to build bridges. It's an opportunity to think about, okay, what are those theological knots that remain, that are disruptive, that are causing problems in interfaith today, in the present context, and thinking about how to work towards resolving them in some way.
So I was born in a Muslim family. I spent 14 years of my life in a Catholic school, and I went to an Israeli university. And then I spent 2 weeks in a Buddhist monastery alongside my interfaith work. And I read all three kind of religious texts out of curiosity and understanding, but also equally learning more about other communities. Now in the UK, I could see that I never had any issues about my religious identities when I was here in the country. I never talked about my religious identity anyways. It's not, you don't identify yourself here as someone who is Arab. You don't talk about your religious identity. And in the UK, there's always that question, oh, she's definitely not a Muslim, she's a Christian. That's always the first thing that people tell me. I used to get that as well here, but more in the UK. She cannot be of a Muslim background. She's definitely a Christian background, definitely. That's always a judgment. And I can definitely not be a Middle Eastern. Again, so two things I always get. And then people get shocked when they know who I am and where I've come from and everything. That's one. Two, I think it's rare for me to talk about my own identity. And I always, when people ask me, we had that discussion just earlier as we sat down, I was like, I actually kind of more reflect on me being human and reflecting on humanity rather than actually saying, well, I come from this place or that religion or this religion. And I think it's more maybe the way I was raised in this country, the family that I'm proud to have had, and I'm thankful to my parents who are no longer with me, that actually taught me this, that actually to reflect on the people around me from a human perspective, and that your religion is for yourself, no matter what it is. It's just something you hold close to yourself and your heart, and it's between you and whoever power, God, whatever you believe in. No one has to do with it. And equally treating people the way you want to be treated. I think that's the basic thing that I grew up on and I'll continue to kind of believe in. Now, the UK has got a lot of baggage around religion. Whether you talk about the Muslim identity, the Jewish identity, the Sikh identity, the Hindu identity, it's a multicultural society. But more and more, we're seeing discussions, talks, disagreements about one community gets different treatment than the other communities. You see a lot of debates around anti-Semitism, around anti-Muslim hatred. Now we see a rise in hatred and polarization in the UK. So anti-Semitism is on the rise, anti-Muslim hate is on the rise, anti-Sikh hate is on the rise, many anti-hate is on the rise. And we see a lot of frictions between communities because certain communities maybe get certain acknowledgement from governments, or certain laws that protect certain communities, or there's certain funding that goes to anti-Muslim hatred or to anti-Semitism, not to anti-Sikh hate. So there's always that element of division that's growing. But also I see more in the UK, the Muslim identity come out within Muslim communities than I see it here in this country, or even in the Middle East, in some countries as well. And it surprised me when I went to the UK and did this work, because whether it's in headlines in newspapers, there's always the element that this person comes from a Muslim background, or this person comes from a Jewish background. I'm like, why are you talking about that identity of the individual in a headline? That's one. Two, there's an element where I think, so if you ask me today who you are, I'll tell you I'm a woman who is a human being who believes in humanity. And when I did a project with American Muslims and British Muslims in the UK, it was interesting that the American Muslims identified as being American before they identified as being Muslim, while the British Muslims identified as being Muslim before they identified as being British. And there were groups of women as well that we brought together. So I think at different time points, I saw in the UK, depending on events, trigger points. So 7/7 bombings that we had the 21st anniversary of yesterday, I saw the Muslim identity become more prevalent in the UK, because people felt that, well, this identity is being under attack, so I want to show my Muslim identity in a certain way. We see that now in a younger generation, even despite the rise in polarization and rhetoric in the UK. And we had riots in Southport in 2024 in the UK. And we've done a survey within our work, and what was interesting out of the survey is that we saw that element where Muslim communities felt more proud to talk about their identity with colleagues and friends, something we haven't seen since 7/7. But it's something as well when we put now groups of different faith communities together, sometimes you have the element of faith come out depending on global events, geopolitics, trigger events that happen locally, nationally, as well as globally. And sometimes really just in terms of that element where you want that acknowledgement from the person in front of you is from a different background, that they see you as a human being.
It's an interesting point also about the way I think American Jews are to some way different than, in terms of putting the American first, which is part of the work. Georgette, I want to ask you two questions about the book. And then, so one of them is you wrote a book about a Holocaust survival story and the successful outcome of that. And you wrote it in a time in which contemporary anti-Semitism was on the rise. Were you thinking about that? Are people asking you about that in current conversations?
Well, what people ask me is, what do you want people to walk away with from this book? This book is quite different from all my other books, because my other books are really kind of 30,000 feet books, taking on big issues. This is a story about a very large story, but told through the lens of one person's life. And what I want people to walk away with is to see this as a cautionary tale about what happens the way that authoritarianism and fascism just creeps up, and the dangers of being in denial or indifferent as it's happening. And we certainly see this happening in the US, we see it happening in Israel, we see it happening in a lot of places. It's also about the price that we pay for identity. What is identity? What is a Jewish identity? And what is the cost to maintain an identity? So I think these are the important lessons of the book. Also, the different ways in which people deal with trauma, because there's a lot of trauma around today also. Of course there is. And looking at the story of Pips and his wife, Olga, the way he dealt with his trauma after hiding underground in Berlin, right under the noses of the Nazis, having been arrested 4 times, escaped 3 times, the things that he had to go through in terms of starvation and finding places to sleep. The way he dealt with it was that he saw the absurdity in everything, and he could laugh at anything. And he loved talking about his story. He would tell his story to anybody who would listen. I can't tell you how many times I heard this story, and I just had to tune out after a while. So he externalized it all, and he just sort of wrote it off as part of the craziness of life, and he saw his career as survival. And so, you know, each day he just did what he had to do to survive, because he wanted to live. His wife, Olga, now he was in Berlin. That's important to mention. He was in Berlin, hiding in Berlin. His wife, Olga, was Hungarian. She's actually the one who's my blood relative. And Olga was in Auschwitz. And then as the Soviets came closer and closer, the death marches began. And she was on the death march from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. When she arrived in Auschwitz, and they got off the trains after 3 days, packed like cattle. We all know the stories. And she and her mother were put on one line, and then there was another line. Men were on one line, women, children on another line. There was a child who was crying after her lost mother. And Olga's mother took pity on the child and took her hand. And that was her death sentence. Because in Auschwitz, anybody with a child younger than 15 was automatically sent to the gas chambers. So Olga suffered enormous, enormous trauma. And she handled it entirely differently. She refused to talk about it. She would not even be interviewed for the Steven Spielberg Survivors of the Shoah project. Everything was internalized, so she became severely depressed for much of her life and ultimately committed suicide. And the older she became, the more haunted she became by her experiences in the Holocaust. And that's how that ended. So it's also an interesting object lesson in how do you deal with trauma and how do you survive trauma.
So I think there's 2 ways to, first of all, I saw you both nodding on the trauma, so if you want to relate to that, and also relating to Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism. Is the Holocaust, yours is a very unique Holocaust survival story because of the half-Jew aspect and of the German, and it's a very, very, it's an untold.
Almost nothing has been written about the experience of Mishlings, especially those who identified as Jewish, in the entire Holocaust canon, which is extensive.
It's a really unique story. So on the one hand, the question of trauma, on the other question of what role does the Holocaust play in current relations between the communities? Should we even, I'm going to be very provocative maybe to that end, should we even be talking about Holocaust when we talk about contemporary anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Muslim hate, or dealing with the current situation?
I mean, if I talk about Holocaust first, a huge amount of work's been done in Jewish-Christian relations relating to the Holocaust. And I would say that, you know, that's always been a very healthy area of Jewish-Christian relations. There's been a huge amount of compassion. There's been a lot of work done within Christianity to empathize, to learn from lessons, to and also in terms of there's been a sense of Christian guilt surrounding it as well, which I don't think is something that should be dwelt on necessarily, but just recognizing that the church has done work in that area. Trauma is such a loaded word at the moment as well, isn't it? And I often talk to people on both sides of the anti-Semitism debates, if you like, who are both coming from traumatized positions in different ways. And the idea that one trauma should silence another is problematic. And I think sometimes we need to think in terms of, you know, everyone needs to be heard. There's this desperate desire to be heard. And when people don't feel heard, there's a real temptation to shout. And of course, the impact there is that it's silencing someone else. And one of the things that I'm most excited about, I've just moved to Tel Aviv. I'm going to be studying there, learning more about Jewish-Christian relations here in this context, you know, outside my UK context. And one of the things I'm most excited about is to hear some of those minority voices that we don't hear so much in the West, and understanding how different traumatized people in different ways are sharing their narratives, but also really trying to make space for different minority voices that have different narratives.
Maybe I start from the Holocaust element and then come back to the trauma element. There actually has been a study that was released today in the UK about Muslim communities, integration, some of the far-right groups that we have growing in the UK, some of them are in politics, and how they see Muslim communities, but also the whole context when you reflect on Muslim communities, how there is quite a percentage of Muslim communities in the UK that deny still the Holocaust, think the Holocaust is a myth. Say the Holocaust is exaggerated, and it's about how do you counter that narrative. So within some of the work that we do is around bringing as well stories of Muslim communities that saved Jewish communities in the Holocaust. So going on the roundabout way to convince Muslim communities, no, the Holocaust existed. This is what happened. And you have the righteous Muslims that their names are in Yad Vashem, but equally as well, some of their stories we captured in a booklet that we have to actually educate a younger generation, but also elderly that deny the Holocaust. Actually, no, it happened, and actually this was the role that Muslims as well played in this. So that's one way of doing it. The other way, today, there's different ways that actually people are using Holocaust denial, right? You've got misinformation, you've got disinformation, you've got the online space. So it's not just Muslim communities. It's like really, how do you counter that narrative that is out there? How do you challenge and educate a younger generation about the Holocaust? And how do you work around challenging disinformation and misinformation? So that's like some of the work that we do around this. and it's important to note that many as well within different backgrounds, far-right groups, some, as I said, within Muslim communities, and some other groups as well, use the Holocaust as a way to attack Jewish communities in Europe and in the UK as well. In terms of trauma, I think, I think I maybe understand the two stories. One that maybe was using humor to kind of, in a way, showcase or kind of get away with the trauma that got impacted, the way trauma impacted them, but at the same time, the one that internalized, Olga, the one that internalized the trauma that unfortunately, at the end of it, she took her life. And this is something that we see even today in many ways. One, post-October 7th, both on the Jewish community side, but equally as well on the Palestinian community side. And one of my colleagues interviewed October 7th survivors a few months ago in January. And I remember when I was seated listening to some of the stories of the survivors, it took me a long time to decompress after that. And I was thinking to myself, the individual that's in front of me, he's resilient, he's talking about how he survived it. But I could see every single element in his body, every single move, every single word, showcasing the trauma he's gone through. And there's many that have gone through this. There's the families as well. We're not talking just about the survivors. We're talking about the families that lost loved ones, the families that are still living the trauma. And you're talking about as well the Palestinian side and really what's happening there and the trauma that is there and how they're internalizing it or showcasing it. And how do we deal with it? Because we're talking today about the present that we're in. We're talking about the Holocaust, which is the past, which continues till today, as well in the stories and the survivors that we're losing. Like we're losing even the survivors of the Holocaust. So these stories as well are going to diminish. So how do we keep this as well alive? But equally as well, you're talking about a new generation of youngsters that have been traumatized post October 7th, and what's going to happen next? How do we deal with that trauma? And how do we have a trauma-informed approach in supporting those communities in different ways? Not just the ones that are in Israel, Palestine. We're talking about everyone that has been impacted by October 7th and post-October 7th. And we see that as well within the work that we do. We offer within the support service that we provide to communities that are impacted by racism. We offer counseling services. And we see a lot that comes out from those counseling services and how trauma is manifesting in different ways. And let's not forget individuals that any human being, let alone the ones that went through the trauma of October 7th, themselves might have issues around domestic violence, might have issues around their own personal life and baggage that is already as well traumatizing them, and adding another layer on top of that. And how do you deal with that? And maybe lastly, when we talk about ourselves, the ones that deal with this topic, that work around this, we're as well impacted by this. We as well have got an element where, I mean, you mentioned, Georgette, you've heard that story all the time. And I could see the emotions and the facial expressions as you were telling the story. And I'm like, oh my God, like, at one point I was like, I really wanted to come up and like just give you a hug, because it takes a lot of resilience and strength to be able to listen to those stories, to be able to document them, but equally as well, surviving everything and talking about it. And you're talking about, like you said, she's one of your relatives, but equally as well, you talked about this story and how you showcase that in the book. And that could be a way as well that sometimes people kind of from the trauma of what they have, express it in different ways. Some have the ability to do it, some don't have the ability to do it. And I think we need to look at the ones that do not have the support to get for the trauma that they've been subjected to. How is that going to manifest? One, either in polarization, but equally as well in the impact on their mental health and well-being moving forward.
So I want to move to a last remarks, maybe by each of you. Maybe, you know, it's a difficult time, of course, but as a positive note, what is it that maybe from the book or maybe in general from your work and what you've heard so far, what do you have to tell us for the future?
Well, I'm a sociologist, and Sociology 101, we learned that contact and communication is the most effective way to dispel stereotypes and correct misconceptions. And I have certainly found this to be very true in my work. And what I'd like to do is give the example of the work that I've done. You mentioned that I founded the Multifaith Alliance in 2013, which initially was an organization that was set up to deal with the Syrian crisis. And it's sort of counterintuitive that a Jew would have taken this on, because of course most Syrians would just as soon see every Jew dead and Israel driven into the sea. I don't blame them for that, by the way. That happens to be the way they're indoctrinated, so they can't help that. But when I read about what was going on in Syria, I was absolutely stunned by the magnitude of the crisis. And everything that I was seeing reminded me of what had happened to my own family in the Holocaust, and to myself, my own displacement as a refugee child. And Leviticus 19:16 kept going through my brain. Thou shalt not stand idly by while the blood of your neighbor cries out from the earth. So I took on a huge task of figuring out, what can I do to not stand idly by? So all these years later, I can say that we have delivered more than $670 million worth of humanitarian aid, most of it into Syria. But we also now operate in Gaza and Ukraine and Turkey. And as you mentioned before, we have helped 4 million war victims. But here's the part that I love the most about the work. Well, there are two things I love the most. It's the only thing I have, the only thing I do, where I can actually measure the impact. We can say, here's the amount of aid we've delivered, here's the number of people who've been helped. Nothing else I do is measurable. It's all, you know, what you were saying earlier. But what I love the most about this is the partnerships that we created between Syrians and Israelis, because it's a great man bites dog story. Syrians and Israelis were able to rise above politics, above hatred, above mutual suspicion, to work together to alleviate terrible suffering. And in the process, their images of each other changed completely. The CEO of my organization, the Multifaith Alliance, is himself a Syrian refugee. He was indoctrinated the way every other Syrian is indoctrinated from birth. Israelis want to drive us off our land. Israelis want to kill us. Jews are the devil because they support Israel. And when he was approached by an Israeli who had no agenda other than to help, and he didn't believe it at first, what does she want with me? Is she Mossad? But he finally realized there was no other agenda other than to help Syrians at their moment of greatest need. And so then he asked himself, as did so many other Syrians, wait a minute, it's not the Israelis who are killing us and driving us off our land. It's our own government. So if that was a lie, what else was a lie? And also Israelis. You know, Israel is not innocent when it comes to stereotypes. Israelis have plenty of stereotypes about Arabs, plenty of assumptions that they make about them. But there too, the stereotypes broke down. So it was just wonderful to see Israelis and Jews, Israelis and Syrians, Jews and Muslims. In order to get this work going, we had to do 2 years of secret meetings, track 2 diplomacy in various capitals around Europe, where Syrians could get visas to come and meet with the Israelis. And there they were, Syrians and Israelis sitting around a table at lunch, laughing together, talking together, Syrians coming to Israel, going to Jaffa, finding a hookah place, and Syrians and Israelis sitting there sucking on their hookahs. And during one of the meetings, part of the Israeli delegation, they had a new baby. They brought the baby along. And to see these Syrians cooing over an Israeli baby, that's the proof of Sociology 101, and that is my hope.
Thank you. I feel very hopeful that we can become more comfortable with discomfort. In the UK, the Reform Judaism and Liberal Judaism have just merged to form the new movement for progressive Judaism. And that brings together people from, the furthest side, the more traditional side of reform, all the way through to the most liberal positions, which is a challenging umbrella to bring lots of people together under, even within one denomination. And I started working with them recently in order to help articulate a theology for this new movement. How do we articulate together, with all the breadth that we bring, how we understand ourselves, both in terms of in relation to the wider jury in the UK, but also in relation to Zionism and Israel. And the first publication that was brought out just recently with Ed Kessler, who's a big name in interfaith relations at the Wolf Institute in Cambridge. Oh, okay, great. He co-edited this new volume called Progressive Judaism, Zionism, and the State of Israel. And I was invited to contribute to this book. And on the first night of this conference, Maya described in poetic terms the notion of trigger points, trigger warnings. And if you pick up this book, it comes with a trigger warning, because it comes with all perspectives on Zionism and the State of Israel. And it was a bold attempt, I think, to model bringing different voices into one space where it was safe to do so. And I think that's my hope. It's my hope that we can create an environment and a space where we can discuss things in disagreement, and not just intrafaith, but also interfaith.
It's hard to follow. I think I'm hopeful for a few things. One, I believe that, well, I'll start with one thing to say, actually, and I build around it. I think in today's world where we are, silence is complicity. And if I would ask from anyone in the room today or beyond this room, for anyone to call out hatred, prejudice, stereotypes, if they say it or where they say it. That's one. Two, we're at a stage where building bridges seems so far away, but I still have a bit of hope. I think the examples that have been shared are I think that we need to speak proudly about, because they do kind of bring people together under the banner of humanity, one. But equally as well, I am hopeful that hopefully, if at one point we have a bit of peace, that people can kind of step back and reflect and see what happened to the other side. And that's maybe what my hope is actually people can step back and look at the other side. And just look. And we can agree to disagree, absolutely, respectfully. But I think this is the one thing that I'm definitely hopeful for people to just step back from their comfort zone and see what's happening on the other side, on all sides. And maybe the last thing is, as the online space as well spirals madly across different ways, and the algorithm is unfortunately pushing a lot of the hate and extremism out there, is finding a way for the voices that are in this room and beyond as well to challenge this. The the algorithms are a business model, and it's about how do we challenge that business model, that despite all of the efforts that we're trying to do on the ground, sometimes that hate wins, and those platforms wins.
So maybe I'll say just also one last word of hope. The reason it's so noisy outside is because on account of the war, there's like 2-3 conferences going on now in the same building, and we've pushed out of the lower floor, and everybody's here. But also we're going out to tours of the city of Haifa. So I think Haifa has always been, in many ways, a model. I think for the future of Jewish-Arab relations in Israel, for the future of interfaith in Israel, for essentially a model of a society that holds both the human values and the connection between the identities and the communities together. And hopefully you'll join us also at some of the tours and see some of that. I want to thank you all for your time and for your generous devotion to the panel and your sharing, and I really appreciate it. I think we might have time for maybe one comment or question that might come. Susan, please.
I've certainly noticed that as well, more of a turning inward. But I think turning inward ultimately hurts the Jewish community. I believe in and have always practiced a kind of outward-facing Judaism, because I think by facing outward and engaging with other communities, that's the greatest protection we could have. Now, it doesn't always hold up. I mean, we saw after October 7th, I think almost all Jewish communities felt completely abandoned. But much of the time, it does hold up.
I think we start where people are at, and I think if their concern is anti-Semitism, then maybe that's where we need to start, and having productive conversations that are actually equipping people to think well in this area. That in itself can be an interfaith initiative. I think that a lot of people feel ill-equipped and are looking for resources, they're looking for information, they're looking for ways of understanding, but there's a lot of anxiety. And so the more that we can equip and support people through those conversations, I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with what has been said, and maybe I'm just kind of gonna swap it with how kind of when things happen within the Muslim communities, and when there's a rise in anti-Muslim hatred. And yes, within the work that we do and we support Muslim communities and this, but if an anti-Semitic attack happens during that time, I will definitely call it out and I'll definitely say something. And I think this is the pivotal point. It's as well, yes, caring for your own community and communities and talking about this, but equally as well calling out what's happening on the other side if other communities are being targeted. And I think this would balance it in a way where, yes, you focus on anti-Semitism, absolutely. I mean, the rise of anti-Semitic hatred and following Bondi Beach, I think it's become intense across the board, and I can see that as well in the UK. But I think it's as well seeing what's happening in other communities, because the more we're looking inwards, at least from the space and the landscape on the UK, the more communities are becoming polarized. And this is definitely the challenge that we have today.
Okay, Well, thanks very much. I just want to also say we have copies of the book outside, signed copies for all of us and for participants and for other people in the conference. Thanks a lot for joining us, Georgette, and for sharing about the book. Thank you, Jules, and thank you, Iman. And looking forward to the continued conversations in the conference. Thank you very much.